So what we have today is an informational meeting to get you all up to speed as to what's going on with our year 25 beach renourishment program. We've put together a presentation. We have some experts standing by to help us out when we need it. We have David Cheekwood from First Tryon. He's a financial advisor for the village. You have Brandon Lofton, who's our bond counsel. Eric Olson, who's our coastal engineer, and Eric's been working on our beaches and structuring our plans for more than 30 years now. And you have Zach Hewitt, who's our financial officer, if you don't know, manager, if you don't know who he is, and Chris McCall, who he's our village manager, but actually Chris used to be our shoreline protection manager, and so he has a lot of history. The way we have this set up today, the presentation, it's all a slideshow presentation with Chris narrating and Zach jumping in when he needs to. But we're going to start off with background on how we got to this point, what's been going on.
Could you increase the output of the microphone so we could hear you?
How's that?
You could hear.
Is that better?
Didn't you?
Is that better?
Speak up.
Okay, I'll try to. I'm kind of losing my voice. Okay, so we're going to start off with a background on our beaches, what's been going on for, as long as we've been here, what work we've been doing. Then we're going to give a kind of an overview of sand management program, our plan. We're going to do a quick takeaway from our different efforts over the years. We're going to put together, we're going to explain the 2025 scope of this project. And we're actually going to talk about some plans going forward as well. Then we're going to jump into the funding, debt obligations, tax implications, and then a schedule for the whole thing. Following that, there'll be a question and answer period. It'll be open to anybody who has questions and answers. Anybody who has answers, right? Anybody who has questions, and then we'll have some closing remarks. I do want to tell you that it's really important that you're here and you're getting informed. This vote's very important. You're just, to put it in context, we've been doing beach renourishment programs for many years. This is just another one. You're in context that the next generation coming to the island, depending on what we do now, just like we've depended on what happened 20 years ago. And with that, Chris, you want to start the show?
All right, thank you, Mayor. Can you all hear me okay back there? All right, I'll try to speak into the microphone. And as they say, when technology works, everything's great. When it doesn't work, it's just downhill. So hopefully we won't have any more delays here. So as the mayor had just briefly mentioned, the various discussion topics that we're going to go over today. And the first one, how we got here in the history of Bald Head Island Shoreline Management, I'm going to take the lead on that. As the mayor indicated, I've been here for almost 20 years. And while I see some familiar faces out there in the audience, I asked the same question when I presented at the Bald Head Island, the Johnston Coastal Sustainability Conference at the Bald Head Island Conservancy back in April. And just by a show of hands, how many folks in the room have lived here on the island at least 5 years? Okay. So those that didn't raise their hand, I'm assuming you've only been here about 5 years.
Part-time, you said you lived on.
Or part-time, okay. Well, the reason I asked that question is, there's a lot of history involved in what the village has done over the last 20 years. And this is just the continuation. And so I want to go through this presentation, and so folks have a better understanding of the purpose and the need for these projects for the long-term benefit. So how we got here, important to note that our shorelines consist of public beaches, which are ever changing. They're dynamic. It's a very dynamic environment. Important to note that the proximity of Bald Head Island nearest the shipping channel to the Port of Wilmington has a significant impact on the island in terms of erosion, in addition to the storms that we have to buffer and require channel maintenance dredging. All these things have an effect on our shoreline. The village has little to no influence over sand placement during the federally funded projects. And what that means is that the core projects that are done routinely to maintain the shipping channel, those are all, while they're all federally funded, the village, we don't necessarily, we don't have the ability to tell the Corps where to put that sand. It's all on the federal dime, and their purpose and in their minds, they're just clearing the channel of the sand so that the ships can make it in and out of port. So in the 2000s, the decade of the 2000s, the village began to take control of our destiny. Many property owners here and listening in may not have been here back then. Thus, the need to acquaint property owners, in addition to reacquainting property owners that have been here for some time. And just to point that much has been done to sustain our shoreline and the investments that have been made over the years. There we go. All right, moving on, the Cape Fear River is the federal authorized navigation channel to the Port of Wilmington. And the Corps of Engineers is responsible for keeping that channel open for shipping. Consequently, the public beach eroded into private property as the channel pulled sand from Bald Head Island. We had houses lost, infrastructure was threatened. In 1994 and 1996, there were significant investments made with sandbag revetments in front of the club and the soft going field that was installed as well. The expansion of the Wilmington Harbor project in 2000 and 2001 led to the creation of the Wilmington Harbor Sand Management Plan, which is a plan that strategically puts sand on the adjacent shorelines of Bald Head Island and the other side of Caswell Beach and Oak Island. What this chart reflects here is the sand management plan and the times at which the village receives the sand and the times at which the other side, Oak Island and Caswell Beach, receive the sand. It's based on a two-thirds cycle where Bald Head Island gets it 2 consecutive cycles. And then the third cycle, it goes to the other side. And it's in that third cycle that the village has had to plan and prepare for its own private beach nourishment project, because if we don't, the tendency, or historically, we've seen that we lose all that sand between the next cycle. So that's been consistent with years past. And so if you look at this table here, you can see in 2015, that was the second cycle of channel maintenance sand. And then in 2018, Oak Island, Caswell Beach received the sand. And this is when the village did its own, we did our own private project in 18-19. And then it went back to the beginning of that cycle where the village got it in 2021. And the village received the sand here most recently in 2023. And then again, the SNP sand will go to Caswell Beach in 2025. And so here we are with our tentative date for our interim Village of Bald Head Island fill project. And then the next time the villages do sand from channel maintenance would be in 2027. So in 2000 and 2001, the Wilmington Harbor project was deepened and widened, and they shifted the shipping channel closer to Bald Head Island. And at that time, it just increased the erosion quite considerably. At the time, there was no federal funding available to implement the sand management plan. It's just to let folks know, Congress appropriates that funding within their federal budget each year. And there's been instances where the budget has had a shortfall, where the core local district hasn't had enough funds to do the project. And so in 2003 and 2004, the Corps commenced what they called emergency dredging of the shipping channel and took that sand offshore and dumped it. In 2004, again, the erosion nearest the channel continued faster than the Wilmington Harbor project changes. And so the village ended up extending and widening that sandbag revetment in front of the club approximately by 200 feet and by 40 feet and a crest of 12 feet high. This is similar to what the Shoals Club's been working on here more recently with erosion at the east end. In addition, there were some homes moved and utilities continued to be threatened. In 04 and 05, we finally got the first round of the sand management plan sand through the dredging of the channel. And at that time, we replaced that soft field groin field. So just to orient you here with this slide, when I talked about the realignment of the shipping channel in 2000, 2001, here's where the channel came through Oak Island, Bald Head, and out offshore. They realigned it closer on this side and brought it straight out. So this sort of gives you a visual of what things looked like back in 2003. When I talked previously about that sandbag revetment and extending it and widening it and increasing the height, that's that sandbag revetment you see here in this photo. And just to acknowledge back then, you can see you actually had the old original second lane of South Bald Head Wine. Present day, this bifurcated 2-lane goes to a 1-lane as you go past the club. In addition, you see the erosion up here on the point affecting these structures here. Just again, as they say, pictures can be worth 1,000 words. And so here's some additional visuals of homes back then threatened by erosion in 2003 on South Beach. This is a couple of our police vehicles on South Bald Head Wine in front of the club. And here's a photo of that sandbag revetment protecting that road in a section. Couple structures being threatened by erosion. Back in 2004, this was a house that was relocated from Sandpiper Trail further inland. And it's interesting, they can move Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. It's pretty easy to move a house, so it can be done. There were challenges, no doubt. This erosion kept on in through 09, 10, and 2011, even after the village did its own private beach nourishment in 2010. And I'll get to the importance of the terminal groin. You'll see here later how it's affected that, the timing or how long that sand stays on the beach. But back in 2011, this photo here on the left shows the conditions of the shoreline along Cape Fear Trail. This was our first groin tube in the groin field. And at the time, the erosion was undermining or had extended back landward behind that first groin tube. So the village made the wise decision to put in this 350-foot sandbag revetment wall, extending from the landward end of that first groin tube northward. Here's a picture of the revetment in 2011 after it was completed. So subsequently later with nourishments in present day, November 2023, there's the delineation of that sandbag revetment. It is buried probably under 15 feet or more of frontal dune. That dune growth, the stability with the terminal groins cause and effect of the terminal groin. So as we continue through the timeline in this history, there was a period where we had a beach nourishment, or the Corps had a channel maintenance project. And again, through congressional appropriation, there was a slight shortfall. So the state and Bald Head Island agreed to kick in some additional funds to be able to dredge the channel to get that much needed sand on the beach. leading up to that and into 2009, it became apparent by the village council at the time that in thinking about that gap year in the sand management plan, that we'd have to do our own private nourishment project, that we'd have to start dedicating funds to make that happen. And so that's when the discussions really got in detail about dedication of a property tax and the creation of the municipal service district zones A and B, which council approved in 2009. In 2009, that sand management plan, the dredging that occurred, that sand went to the Castle Beach and Oak Island side. And lack of sand on the island resulted in devastating erosion. So in 2010, the village funded its first engineered beach project with voter approval of the GEO bond for $18 million. This included 1.85 million cubic yards of sand and replaced the soft filled groin tubes. It's important to note in the quote engineered beach that this was in thinking long term that status engineered beach is FEMA approved, which means that if the beach takes a severe hit from a tropical storm or hurricane, really a hurricane more likely, and that hurricane is considered a disaster, a declared disaster by the federal government, the village can replace that sand on the beach that was lost due to the storm. We've been through that. I'll talk a little bit further. So that was the investment in creating that engineered beach project, that very first one, for the long-term gain and benefit. So in 2011, again, no federal funding for the sand management plan. And this was when Hurricane Irene damaged the engineered beach and 5 of the 16 soft groins at the time. It says the village paid $230,000. Well, the village paid the $230,000 for that 350-foot sandbag revetment that I showed you in that previous picture there in front of Cape Trail. But we also had to repair the groin field to protect South Bald Head Wind and the utility infrastructure behind it, the water and sewer lines and roads. In 2012, up to that point, the village had spent about $25 million cumulatively to study and mitigate beach renourishment and the impacts from the Wilmington Harbor maintenance project. At the time, the channel shoaling was so bad that the Corps had to move one of the buoys and conduct some emergency dredging to deposit sand offshore. And in 2012, leading up to 2012, probably started in 2009 timeframe to work through getting the legislation passed through the North Carolina General Assembly that would permit the terminal groin project. But by 2012, that had been approved and the village had started working on the engineering and design of the terminal groin for the point at West and South Beach. So this photo just shows at the time back in 2012 where they relocated that buoy that was here further in. And this reduced the shipping channel width to the extent that they could only use one lane of traffic. Yes, believe it or not, there's actually 2 lanes of traffic out there, but when you see those big ones coming through, it's hard to believe it. But at the time, the shoaling from the sand coming off Bald Head coming back into the channel had shoaled this up so bad that those ships, the river pilots had to navigate, maneuver around it in and out. So this photo just shows the point and the reference to the terminal or the groin field. You know, those groin tubes that have been in place since 1996. And I highlight groin 16 because that is the groin tube nearest the channel here. So as this sand's migrating its way from east to west, you can see the sawtooth effect where it slowly traps the sand on the one side of the groin, slowly releasing around to the other until it gets to the last one. Once it gets beyond that, it's just shoaling back into that channel. And so with sand placements occurring about every 2 years, all this area and erosion without the terminal groin structure on average was occurring in a time span of 16 months, 14 to 16 months, more or less. Very fast and rapid erosion. Here's a photo of the shoreline post-terminal groin structure in 26 and much more stability along the oceanfront shoreline with that sand impoundment at the very end there, maintaining through the groin tubes, all protecting the infrastructure landward behind it, this frontal dune system. If you remember that first picture early on that showed that sandbag revetment wall in front, it's buried and it's covered. And I'd say it's at least 18 feet or higher in dune elevation since time. So this visual is just the before and after with the terminal groin structure. Again, real fast, rapid, quick, accelerated erosion of the point and beyond in front of the club as that sand's making its way back to the channel. Here in 2018, a couple years post terminal groin construction, you can see the tip of the terminal groin here, but all this is being maintained. And the terminal groin is slowing that rate of erosion significantly. So continuing the timeline, 2012 to 2013, when I referenced the losses from Hurricane Irene and the FEMA engineered beach project, we were able to get FEMA public assistance reimbursement of about $1.88 million to replace about 136,000 cubic yards of sand and 5 groin tubes. So moving on, in 2015 and 16, the village received the permits to construct the terminal groin structure, 1,300 linear foot structure, $8 million. We did this that coincided during the Wilmington Harbor Sand Management Navigation Channel dredging, and worked the deal out with the Corps to place sand in a specific area just behind the terminal groin that's known as the fillet. That's required to maintain by state law. In addition to that, we did some other work around the island shorelines. In particular, we extended the Marina Channel entrance jetties and put spurs on them to slow that rate of erosion of the sand going into the channel. For those that might remember, when Limited had managed the Marina Channel entrance, before those jetties were extended, those spurs were put on, they were almost in there weekly doing something, dredging. And at one point, it got so bad, they had to get the clamshell bucket to go in because it had shoaled in so much to remove that sand. But all to say, the extension of the jetties with the spurs is very effective and is working. In addition, we installed 2 breakwater. They call them breakwaters. They're just that if you're coming into the Marina Channel and you look northward along Rowboat Road, there's those 2 breakwaters that the purpose of those slows the wave action from ferry and other vessel traffic as it's coming into the channel to slow the erosion of the Rowboat Road area and northward. In 2018, the Wilmington Harbor Project channel maintenance was performed in the summer, which is unusual, but due to Corps congressional appropriation shortfall, they could not do that project until the summer with the sand going at that time to Castle Beach and Oak Island. As we were, at that time, we, the village, were working on our second private placement project that we placed 1 million cubic yards of sand from Jaybird Shoals on the South Beach, and we replaced the soft tube groin field in 2018 and 19. So combined with the Wilmington Harbor Channel Maintenance sand that we get through the sand management plan, the village private projects that we've done, the structures with the terminal groin that we've installed, we estimate that 60% or so of South Beach eastward from the terminal groin has been positively affected with all the work that's been done. We continue to work with the Corps. We got the sand again in 2021, where they dredged 1.8 million cubic yards out from the Federal Navigation Channel, which it says was well above expected amounts on average when the Corps dredges the channel. It's 1.2 to 1.3 million cubic yards. And that's the volume that they're removing from the channel. It doesn't necessarily equate to the amount that's actually being placed on the beach, because they don't get paid to put it on the beach. They get paid to clear it from the channel. So I just want to make that point. When we do our own private projects, we have total control and flexibility of where that sand goes and how much goes, and we pay the dredger to fill that template, if you will, of where that sand goes. So we have total control. And in 2022, we know the challenges at the east end and the erosional phenomenon that's been occurring at the east end of South Beach and in front of the Shoals Club, of their efforts to put in the fan tube revetment and ongoing efforts to get a variance like in similar fashion to increase the width and height of that revetment. And as the mayor indicated, where we are today let me back up. The 2023 project that was just completed was the Corps dredging with the sand management plan sand for 1 million cubic yards. So this table reflects the various beach disposals or sand placement activities on Bald Head Island going back to 1991 to the present 2023 project. Out of all those, you can see the volumes and the sponsor or who funded those projects. And since my time here, starting in 2004, I was actively involved from the 2005 project to the present. And you can see we've done the large private placement projects in 2009 and 2010 at 1.85 million cubic yards. And then the second large fill beach nourishment project in 1819 of 1.1 million cubic yards. And this visual just takes that table and shows it visually, where you can see the village projects in 2009-10, where we got to about Loggerhead Trail. Then the 1819 project here. There have been the two core projects here and here that got almost down to the end. So a lot's been done over the years. But this visual shows the before and after, just to orient you. Again, here is South Bald Head Wind in front of the club. This was in 04-05 after the Corps came in and did that channel maintenance dredging and covered that sandbag wall. And then, as we typically do with all our projects, we come in and plant rows of sea oats. And over time, the sea oats grow. They start out as little sprigs, not more than 6 inches high, and they continue to grow and grow as they trap sand, and that dune grows in height. And so you can see the change just in 2 years. Obviously, it's much significantly higher today. Here's just some more before and afters of some houses on South Beach back in 04 at the time that were underneath water at high tide. This is present day with that high dune ridge in front. Also in width, it's important to know that frontal dune system and how wide it is today. Again, before and after. You'll note this property owner at the time had gotten a permit to put sandbags in front of the home to try to protect it temporarily. You won't see those today. We had to put in a public beach access to go up and over that frontal dune. This was another structure. All those structures at the time on the beach got permits by the State Division of Coastal Management to put sandbags for temporary protection. You can see that high dune ridge in front. Just to note some work and effort that was done out on East Beach back in the 08 to 2011 timeframe. That was just a period of time on East Beach where a number of farms had come through and leveled what little bit of frontal dune existed at the time. But here, this picture creating that flat beach profile without much of a dune, where we came in and did emergency sand pushes with bulldozers. We pushed up that berm. And then again, we planted it, put some sand fence in. This is present day. And this photo is looking north from Beach Access 42. Similar fashion, we did the same, and this is a visual looking south towards the Shoals Club from Beach Access 42 on East Beach for the push, planted, and nice dune system there. So what have we learned? Engineered stabilization with structures works. We need to have sand. We need to have the structures in place, and we need to have plans long-term to maintain that with continuous projects to keep the beach full, to protect the public infrastructure, the water, sewer, roads, etc. All of which we can see is now better protected in various areas along our shoreline. This affects property values and investments that have been protected, enhanced. There is recognition that bird nesting and in some areas, turtle nesting areas being preserved and or enhanced. Again, the reference to the engineered beach for non-federal projects is eligible for FEMA post-disaster funding to mitigate storm damage. And to recognize we have experience in receiving public assistance funds for our engineered beach coming out of Hurricane Irene in 2012. The 2025 plan as proposed, we've got a dedicated webpage for that Karen, our public information officer, has on her website. But just to recognize in terms of the east end of the public South Beach, the last mile or more has, if you go back to that table and that visual, has seen little direct sand placement since 2000, with only approximately 4 projects that have extended past the Killigray Ridge or Flores Bluff area. Private properties at this location have seen some loss of their property to the ocean. With that, the village is looking at a 2-pronged solution, a Section A and a Section B. The Section A of the project would, pull this map up here. The Section A of the project would place sand at the terminal groin fillet and extend to the east for a certain distance, and then pick back up with the Section B fill in the general proximity of Killigray Ridge, Flores Bluff, and extend to the end of the east end of South Beach. The Section A West End project is looking to dredge approximately 500,000 cubic yards from the offshore borrow site at Jaybird Shoals. The sand, it's imperative that we have to continuously keep that terminal groin, fill it full, and the soft tube groin filled full for it to work. In addition, we'll look to replace 13 of the soft tube groins in that area. The soft tube groins are made out of a geotextile fabric material, and on average, once they become exposed, that geotextile material will start to break down at the ends in the intertidal zone, and they will unravel, and the sand that's pumped into them will escape. So they will deflate. And so typically on average, every project we do, by then it's time to replace those soft tube groins. With the Section A project and replacement of the soft tube groins, and we'll get into more of this, but for now, we're not expecting any impact on taxes as we complete our debt service obligation for that 2018-2019 project that we did with that GEO bond. Typically, with the past two projects, we've aligned them such that we've paid off the debt of the previous one before we take on the principal debt of the upcoming project. And focus on our efforts to continue the long-term maintenance of the shoreline, of the terminal groin, and the soft tube groin field, which are requirements of the state and the Corps. So going back to that Section A West End project, I want to show this visual and the approximate length from the terminal groin fillet here, extending eastwards down in the vicinity of Muscadine Wine at about 7,500 linear feet. Section B, the East End project, we look to dredge approximately 500,000 cubic yards of sand from the Jaybird Shoalsboro site, and to place that sand in the proximity of Flores Bluff to Killigray Ridge area eastward to the point at Cape Fear. The total cost of this project, $4.5 million. Just to note that the village has requested a federal grant for $4.5 million. We'll get into in more detail with the financials. But if received, it will not be necessary to issue the $4.5 million in bonds. Only the 13.5 if all is started. So that's no impact on taxes. And at this point, we are expecting approval. It's in the congressional budget. The time frame to get that news will likely be sometime in February. There's still a number of spending bills that Congress has to approve beyond the 4 that they approved some weeks ago to keep the government running. It happens this earmark is in one of those spending bills. And we work through our local Congressman Rouser's office to get that in the bill. If the federal grant is not approved, there will need to be an increase in the property tax to cover the debt service obligation. So looking at that Section B or the East End project in the general vicinity of Flores Bluff and Killigray Ridge, extending east to the end of South Beach in the vicinity of the Shoals Club, about 6,500 linear feet. And just to note, this imagery was flown in November of 2023, and it's overlaid with the parcel lines for properties along that stretch there, and we can see that shoreline has receded well further landward of the ends of those platted properties.
May I ask a question about that visual? Where you show your dotted line, this is probably a stupid question, but I'll ask it anyway. How far out will the sand come? Will it come to that
Right, yeah, that dotted line is not reference to the length of the fill. On average, it would probably be consistent with what you see up here from the most previous channel maintenance fill. Extend on down. But it's important to note that the village does, in its shoreline monitoring program, we do surveys in the fall, and then we do surveys in the spring, and our engineer takes those surveys. And when I say surveys, we have about 200 transects or lines, if you will, that extend from the dune seaward out to a negative 16 feet of depth into the shoreline, into the water. And taking that survey data, our engineer can crunch the numbers, if you will, and derive areas of accretion or erosion within a particular stretch or of the shoreline as a whole. So it gives us a sense of where the sand's going. And to better, when it comes time to prepare the formal fill template design, where the sand's going to go, we'll know better coming after that May survey timeframe.
Betty, so in answer to your question, the graphic is length, not width. Yeah.
We won't go with for a while.
With the East End project, there's some other village actions just to recognize as we continue to work. I say we, our coastal engineer, Eric Olson, with our monitoring. But in recognizing that the conditions of the shoreline and in sections is a dynamic and it fluctuates, and we'll know more as time moves forward in the next 12 months, more or less. You know, the last 12 months, I think we've seen a relatively stable, not so much on the east end. And when I say stable, though, I'm talking about from storm related impacts, that in terms of what we've historically had to deal with. But anyway, it's just a continuous monitoring and analysis and assessing as we get closer to that, the project, in terms of where the sand's going to go and how much. We are working with the Corps on an agreement that may allow for village input when they do the channel maintenance, maintenance dredging events on those 2 years to be able to, through, they call it contributing funds. We're going to have to pony up something, but to be able to put, when they dredge the channel, if we need sand further down the shoreline, that option is available through what they call memorandum of agreement. And so we're working with the core local district on that for the 2027.
I just want to note, so in the past, Chris brought this up a couple of times. The Corps is going to go as far as federal money lets them go. They don't care where the sand goes. And part of our agreement goes up on our beach. 3 years ago, plus or minus, Andy and I met with the Corps, and at that time, we were trying to convince them there was skin off your back to spread the sand to our advantage. And they don't want to hear about it. And so when you look at the two projects that Chris described, A and B, obviously it's the same amount of sand, but for some reason one is 13.5 and the other one's 4.5. The upfront cost, the mobilization to do the sand replenishment is very expensive. And so that's why one of them is so much higher. And the other part of the cost is piping it down the whole beach. This contract that we're trying to get together with the Corps of Engineers takes advantage when the Corps is there. They already absorb the mobilization costs. If we can just tack on to their projects, it's to our advantage. So that's what we're working on.
Question on that funding or the lobbying efforts with the Corps. there ever been any studies or anything for discussion about possibly where we save them money by doing this and we can show less sand going in there and then maybe that, is that?
Yeah,
Not to that extent. I mean, the Corps recognize the terminal groin has provided some benefit or relief to the shoaling in the channel, but to the extent that they acknowledge it and would change anything about the funding and when they do and how they do it, no.
I think it might be a net zero to them, it might be able to help convince them that it's a good thing for them.
We did change our federal lobbyist, and the new firm has former Army Corps of Engineer legal staff experience that is, which frankly led to the the mutual agreement concept and the possibility of having conversations about changing the way these things are done. So we're making progress. Nothing's locked in yet, but we're making progress.
yeah, I was smiling because our lobbyists are well briefed on exactly what you were describing. Yeah,
So the village has been working since about 2017, 2018 in identifying Frying Pan Shoal as the future long-term borrow site for our village private projects. And to orient you, the Frying Pan Shoal features at the convergence of the south-facing shoreline and the east-facing shoreline as it extends out from Cape Fear, the point there in proximity to the Shoals Club. And so we've been working on with the state and federal regulatory agencies on the permitting of that, which we've been dealing with some challenges as our attempts to get permits for that would be the first of any local government entity requesting that. So there's some concerns from the environmental agencies on impacts to the fish. So, yeah. But nonetheless, that there's, the Jaybird Shoal Bar site will pretty much be tapped out, according to our engineer. And so that Frying Pan Shoal has a lot of sand that can last a long time.
Where is the Jaybird Shoal?
The Jaybird Shoal is if you're coming to the island on the ferry and you're coming into the Marina Channel entrance and you look to your right outbound, it's that shoal feature out there you might see that sometimes it's what you see is part of that larger shoal feature, but it's on the other side of the shipping channel. The other things that we're working on with our engineer and with our lobbyists are efforts for the possibility of seeking state approval to take the soft groin field, excuse me, twofold here. Part of what we're working on is taking the existing soft groin field and converting that to a hardened groin field with rock. That'll take some engineering and design in addition to with what we're experiencing at the east end of South Beach, the potential for a groin field at that end, whether it's soft or hard, or a terminal groin at the point. So these are just all options, tools in the toolbox, as they say, that again require, as an example, to engineer and design the terminal groin that we have today. That was about a 3-year process and highly intensive numerical modeling and with the engineers. So it's not something that, we can say in concept today, but it's going to take a lot more work down the road to do that, in addition to getting legislative authority from the state to be able to do that, because at the present moment, that's not a available option. All right. Yeah.
Excuse me, is there any, that's the first time I've heard this, is there any chance in hell
that could be successful. I've always understood that with the method you got to do the terminal line. That was once in a lifetime deal. Don't come back, is it?
Well, the original bill that was approved by the General Assembly allowed for 4 terminal groin structures. 3 of them were for public beaches, Bald Head, Ocean Isle, and Holden Beach. And then the 4th one was a private terminal groin at Figure 8. To date, Bald Head Island did put in the first one, Ocean Isle finally put in one, Holden Beach hasn't, and Figure 8 has not. But in the midst of that, there were requests where they added the ability to do a couple more structures. I want to say at Topsail Island, or I'm looking at Karen because she worked up there at the time, but they've changed that. I will add that there is some differences between the terminal groin that we have now nearest a 42-foot shipping channel versus a terminal groin at the end of, down in front of the Shoals Club, and all these are, they're also site specific, so it requires the modeling and the engineering I mean, it's a good question in terms of how the state might see that too. So.
You just to know, we brought our state assemblyman, we've had, people. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So we have brought people out from the state to review this with them, and they're well aware of our problem, and they've kind of come on board to work with us. Whether that's going to be successful or not, I don't know, but there's efforts going that way.
And I would just add, Dick, I mean, we all know the point of the Cape Fear is very dynamic. And the point of the Cape shifts from a southward direction to an eastward direction, and it kind of swings back and forth over time. So whatever alternatives we look at, keep that in mind. You know, sand moves from north to south on East Beach, and at that part of South Beach, it moves west to east. So sand is constantly moving toward the point, which is why the point shifts and moves based on winds and waves and storms and so forth. Our intent, based on the consensus of the council so far with Chris's input and speaking to coastal engineer, whatever we come up with has to work for both East Beach and South Beach. You can't do something for one beach and negatively impact the other.
Yeah. All right, so I know we're in this for about 50 minutes so far, but wanted to make sure everybody got a good understanding of the history and sort of how things used to be and how much work we put into it up to this point and sort of where we are today. And so at this point, I want to transition it to the project funding and the potential borrowing and scenarios based on the bond referendum to be held on March 5th. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to our finance officer, Zach Hewitt, who's been heavily involved in working with our financial advisors, David Cheatwood, and our bond counsel, Brandon Lofton. So, Zach.
Good morning. So as you all know, the village is going to hold 2 GEO bond referendums to fund the beach improvement projects. And for y'all today, we have 3 possible scenarios worked out to fund those portions of the project. So scenario A would require the passing of referendum A at 13.5 million. Scenario B assumes that the referendum A and B would be passed for an additional 4.5 million to give you 18 million total. And scenario C would require that both referenda are passed, and the village will call on remaining funds from a prior GEO bond authorization for an additional 2.2 million, which gives you 20.2 million for that scenario.
Can I ask a question? What is scenario C? It's, we talked about the 2-prong approach. What's the third one?
So the scenario C gives us a little leeway in case the bids that come back for dredging are higher than expected.
So scenario C is
worst case
It's
scenario.
not a different scenario, it is just more funding.
Yes, ma'am.
But it says from prior geo bonds, so is there excess from a prior geo bond?
Yep.
So it wouldn't be an additional 2.2. You're just taking.
It wouldn't be an additional 2.2 authorization. That money has already been approved
The money is actually from a
prior bond
prior,
that wasn't called on. Yep,
so there would really be no additional tax consequence potentially for the additional 2.2.
there would, and yep,
Alright.
we'll talk about that.
I hadn't been shut here right now.
So referendum A, the debt obligation that we be presented, as Chris mentioned earlier, it's 13.5 million. Over a 7-year term at an estimated 4.5%. That's from our financial advisors. As you can see, the way the debt would be structured is a flat debt service. So there'll be no impact as far as increasing property taxes for that referendum. We would pay upfront in 2026, and then it would remain that level at about 2.5 million for the remaining 6 years. So with referendum B, with A and B passing, that gives us an additional $4.5 million. Again, at a 7-year term at 4.5%. And as you can see in fiscal year 26, our debt service obligation would increase to about 3.2 million, where it would remain at that level for the remaining 6 years. And so,
I just want to say, I'm trying to understand this.
yep, and we'll work through the different scenarios. These are just introducing the two.
You're talking about funding options, but the scenarios relate to what the stand, where the stand is gonna go. In both of these, you're saying you need the 2.2 million in order to accomplish either one of them?
Not yet. The 2.2 would only come into play if, when we bid the project out, the bids came in excess of 18 million.
Okay,
Does that make sense? The 13.5 that we are projecting would handle the section A part of the beach. And then the 4.5 that we would handle the section B of the beach, at 18 million. If the bids come in inflated and high, and we got to call on that extra 2.2 million that is sort of out there in authorization, but we never went to a bank and borrowed it, we can call on that additional 2.2. So that's saying a bid comes in to do all this for like $20 million. We have the ability to borrow that.
and the 2.2, which is a leftover from the 2018,
Correct.
that has never been called upon, so it's never been included in our tax scenario?
Correct.
And likewise, so that same scenario, the 2.2 is left over. Similarly, if all the bids came in low, it's like, all of a sudden we got approval for 18 million and we only needed 15. It's like, well, then we'd have this extra approval similar to the last time.
He's got a question.
Yeah.
Chris, I was gonna wait for all my questions, but this might be a good time for this. Because when you present cost estimates, my first question is, I'd like to review the computations, the mobilization costs, the sand cost, the pumping costs and all that. And then my second question is, are they engineers' estimates or are they contractor bid prices? Because engineers' estimates, in general, are done higher. They're done higher so that you can make sure that you get the appropriate funding and you don't have to go back. So if that's what's happening, which generally happens, I know I've done this for years, okay? If that's happening, is there an opportunity to go out there and see some recent bids and see what we think the real costs are gonna be versus what we're trying to say we gotta fund as a worst case scenario? I know in our industry, we had a point where our agencies told us, you gotta stay within 10% or justify it, but I know where you're going with these. These are for budget. These engineers' estimates are for your budgeting, not for the actual cost.
Yeah, we have to put it out to bid and we receive contractor bids for them. And so
So the question is, do you go out and sole source it or do you go out for like 3 bids?
yeah, we have to go for a minimum of 3 because of the cost. So yes.
to reassess that real cost might not be bad, so that people on our side understand what you estimate in your budget versus what you think the real cost is.
Right, I mean, obviously, we have a lot of variables,
Oh, yeah.
and all of them are in flux and moving, and to include our ability to develop a bid document that we can put options into it, and we can assess based on the bids when they come in, ultimately what, and based on what we get bond approval to do, right? And how we do that.
And so now let's talk about the additional 2.2 million that is out there. It's included with our debt obligations that are outstanding. So with our LGC application, we're required to issue a statement of debt that lists the outstanding GEO bond debt that the village has, the proposed financing, which would be the 2 referenda, also unissued bonds authorized by voters. That would include that 2.3 million. And also include the percentage of net debt to assess property values. So I have that condensed better here. So right now, outstanding from the 2018 GEO bond, we have about 4.7 million. The 2 proposed GEO bonds total 18 million. We have 2 unissued bonds authorized by adopted orders, one for 2.3 million. And then the public transportation bond for 54 million. And then we have 3 installment financings that are outstanding that are about $4 million for a total gross debt of about 83 million. And so using that number, we can calculate our net debt or the percentage that net debt bears to our assessed property values. And utilizing current valuations, that puts us at about 4.5%. Of note, this is about, I think, 1.5% less than the last time we went for a GEO bond. So it's because property values have gone up, that percentage has gone down. And the max allowed under statute is 8%. So to hit on that 2.3 million that's outstanding from the unissued bond, we'll look at what impact that would have if we had to call on that. So just not to get confused here. So we're saying that 2.2 million will be called on out of the 2.3, so not the full 2.3. And that's estimated over a 7-year term at 4.5%, which would ultimately make the debt service structure go up to about 3.6 million, and it would remain there for about 6 years. That's beginning in fiscal year 26. So how do taxes impact this? Just to note, property owners have been paying a dedicated property tax for beach renourishment since about 2010. And a portion of that island-wide base rate is allocated toward beach renourishment debt service. So you can see here, the base rate in 2010 was 26.5. Of that 26, 8 cents was allocated toward debt service for beach renourishment. This year, we have about 57.8 cents, and of that, 8.06 cents is allocated toward debt service. The MSD zones were created in 2010. That was to help in the repayment of the debt service. That's in addition to this island-wide base rate. So in 2010, it was 26.5, and if you lived in MSD zone A, you would be paying 30.5.
Before you go on, Chris, you want to explain the MSD? I mean, a lot of people here, if you're living in the forest, there's probably, you would have no idea what the MSD zones are because you don't pay it. So if you could just.
Right, so when this structure was set up in 2009, 2010, and the council adopted at the time, in theory, the MSD zone A was for those properties that were directly on the oceanfront shoreline that would receive more of a direct benefit from sand placement in terms of protection from storm surge and wave runoff from storm events. And the MSDB zone was identified as properties from the line of the A zone properties back to the Dune Ridge line, if you will. And so that's how those were set up.
So in addition to our property taxes that we allocate toward debt service repayment, we also allocate a portion of our accommodation taxes to that debt service repayment. And just as an example, the current 2018 GEO bond, the way we have it structured now, island-wide taxes fund about 60% of that, with MSD Zone A at about 10%. B at 8%, and then we fund the remaining portion of that with accommodation taxes, 22% or $534,000. Ignore my colors here. This got changed at the end, so they don't line up, but here's the legend to show you. And so let's talk about tax implications on the three scenarios. According to our financial advisors, in scenario A with the referendum A, there will be no change in property tax rates. There's enough already included there to help fund that, that flat debt service payment. So as we looked at this graph before, just to show you all how that would be, that payment or repayment will be structured with island-wide taxes, MSD Zone A, B, and accommodation taxes. And when we say flat debt service, we just mean that it's going to be a flat repayment structure, the same amount every year. In scenario B, with the additional $4.5 million, as Chris mentioned earlier, if the federal grant is approved, there will be little to no impact on the property tax rate. If it's not approved and the village is approved to borrow the full $4.5 million in addition to the 13.5, there would be tax implications. And conservative estimates have it at an island-wide rate would need to go up by 3.5 cents, and both MSD zones would need to be increased by 1.25 each. So this is the debt structure of the GEO bonds with both the 13.5 and the 4.5 included, and just how that debt service will be structured for repayment. As you can see, currently our ad valorem taxes cover about 1.4 million. That would go up to about 2.2 to help cover that repayment. And people ask, well, how will that affect my property bills, or my property tax bills, excuse me. Just as an example, if your property is valued at 1.5 million, your current tax rate and your current tax bill is about 8.7 million.
8.87.
Oh, I'm sorry, 8,700. Yeah, sorry about that. With the 3.5 cent increase, your base rate for your bill would go up $525. And if you're in one of the respective MSD zones, it would go up another $190, which is to about $713. If the 4.5 million was approved, in addition to the 13.5. So as we talked about the 2.2 million, conservative estimates have it at an increase to the island-wide rate of about 5.5%, and both MSD zones would have to go up by about 1.8%. And the debt structure of that loan repayment, it would raise it right at 1.1 million, I believe. And then here's the debt structure or the repayment structure. As you can see here, we went from 1.4 to about 2.4, so about an additional $1 million to cover that. And like before, let's just use 1.5 as an example. At the current rate, with the additional 5.5 cents, the tax bill would go up by about $820. If you're in an MSD zone A or B, it would go up an additional $275 for a tax bill increase of $1,100. That's annually.
All right, so at this point, looking at the project schedule, just to highlight the things that we've done in our planning and preparation, going back to February 2022 council retreat. And here with the upcoming bond public hearing this coming Friday, and the referendum in March of 2024 on through project bid, awarding, construction in January 2025 with a project completion of May 2025. That's the objective.
Chris,
Yes.
sorry, can I ask another question about the funding? We've talked about 13.5, 4.5, and then this 2.2. When it's presented to us, are we going to be authorizing or asked to authorize the 2.2 in addition to the others? So we understand the full impact, or is it, we're just voting A and B and then there's a possibility C could happen and we won't vote on it?
The vote is for, you're gonna have two questions on the ballot.
Right.
One is gonna be for 13.5.
Right.
The other one's gonna be for 4.5. That's it.
And if you need the 2.2, which will have result in the biggest impact on our taxes, do we get any option to?
You voted on that back in 2019. You gave us the authorization back then to expend that money.
I understand that, but it has not affected our taxes yet, so it's a different scenario.
Right.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure, because it's a little confusing, that last slide where the 2.2 had the biggest impact. It was all cumulative. So the 2.2 actually had the smallest incremental impact.
I understand
Subbing
that,
A,
but
B,
we're
and C
talking-
was the
When we
biggest.
talk about effective
Right.
tax rate, it's either gonna be one or another. And that third component is something that this council will decide, not the homeowners. Right? Because we already
That's-
approved the bond.
That's right.
That's good.
All right.
Driven by the competitive bids of the three different
And-
vendors, yeah.
Would be helpful.
Yeah, I think one thing that you have to remember, you don't have to remember it, but when we're talking about, and we might get a grant, the village always has to be working under the assumption we didn't get the grant. So whole different story, if we get the grant, and there's every indication that we will, but we can't be working that way.
The reason I'm bringing up the question is, I mean, in my time in corporate America, you always had to build that contingency in to what you were gonna ask approval for. In this case, that third component is not being built into what you're asking for approval for. And I'm reacting to that.
No, I get it.
Is that grant possible to come in prior to primary day?
We're anticipating February, right? Right, it really depends on
We-
if they
yeah,
ever
we-
pass.
We hope they would have voted on that with them other bills back in last month. But the latest from our federal lobbyist is early February.
How much is the grant for?
Or 4.5 million.
So your 4.5% estimate from your financial advisors, is that current advising on current interest rate environment?
Yeah, I think they're on the line now. Karen, can you see if David's available?
Yeah, I just, Brandon actually raised his hand.
Okay.
So I think he can speak. Brandon?
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to respond to the question about the 2.2 and what the voters will be voting on. It is correct that the 2.2 was already authorized by voters in a previous referendum. However, the ballot questions for both the 13.5 and the 4.5 will show voters the impact of all three being issued. So in other words, when you go to vote on the ballot, you will see the potential tax impact of the 2.2 included. So you'll have that information at the time of the ballot. And you can also look at the disclosure statements, which have been posted, which include those estimates as well. So that information, the complete impact of the 13.5, 4.5, and 2.2 is available and will be part of the ballot language.
Yeah,
Thanks,
great.
Brandon.
And then David's on there. Answer the question about the interest rate.
Yeah.
Great. Good morning. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, so the 4.5% is based on estimated current market rates with cushion. If the village was to sell these GO bonds today, you'd be around 3.5%. So you've got about 1% of cushion in that 4.5% estimate right now.
Thanks, Dave.
Real estate valuation has been all over the place, but mostly up. And in some areas of the world, the United States is coming down. When is the valuation of my property going to be, this is what you're valued? 2023, 2025, what?
Yeah, so the county just did a reval, right? So that's the property valuation that we're using for these calculations. So the current valuation today.
It's every 4 years.
Every 4 years, yes.
All right, so just to wrap up with the timeline to the March 5th referendum, again, the public hearing this coming Friday. And then several dates beyond that to get to the March 5th primary day. And the advance here. There we go. So what happens if not approved? We'll just continue to monitor pending natural recovery of the beaches. Potential threat to loss of the public and private infrastructure landward of the frontal dune system and the primary dune, dune for storm protection of the water, sewer and roads. Properties along the eastern end of South Beach will may continue with sand losses. And with some of those properties, depending on the level or the distance of erosion landward could create some of those properties as being unbuildable by state Division of Coastal Management requirements. And of course, the impacts, the continued impacts to the Shoals Club. So I know we've been going for about 1 hour and 20 minutes and just want to thank everybody. But also, I know there's been some questions that have come up throughout the presentation. We did want to open up if there were any other questions here from folks here.
I don't think people online can hear it.
Okay, yeah. So if you wanted to ask a question, you can come to the podium to ask the question.
Simple. All of your projections are based on a 7-year debt structure, right? What are we projecting based on current erosion rates? How long the benefits of these projects are going to last?
Yeah, good question. So the rate structure is really driven by our need to pay back that debt and principal and interest in that time frame before we have to do another project. So we're not paying for 2 projects at one and all that debt associated with it. That in terms of the erosion and what we think we may or may not see with the erosion, it's really driven by paying the debt off more than anything.
So they do match up.
Not necessarily, you know, no, not necessarily. I mean, depending, you know, the beach is dynamic. It's ever fluctuating. It's eroding and accreting and.
So are interest rates. There's a lot of you know, fluctuation and
right.
And variables. But are you trying to tie it to the two? Trying to tie the two together? Or are you going to come back to the well early?
No, we're actually trying. We're trying to get to the next Corps of Engineers project, basically is our debt service, our debt is going to go the full 7 years. But the efforts that we're making right now are to try and keep the beaches stable until the next Corps of Engineer project.
Yeah.
And obviously, I mean, this is a great year for hurricanes, you know, and who knows what's going to happen next year and, you know, all of our efforts, you know, might disappear and it might be another great year and we'll just keep on accreting.
But,
And I would just add,
if there's a major catastrophe, it's covered by FEMA, right?
Yeah, FEMA, there is the opportunity for that.
But it has, thank you, my mic doesn't work, but it has to be an engineered beach to get FEMA funding, right? Correct. So without any engineering solutions out on the East Beach, would we get FEMA funding to replenish the beach on the east end?
Well, all of our shoreline is included in our engineered beach.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So it would cover.
Yeah.
The other thing I would add, Mark, is that in the 1990s and the 2000s, the village made the conscious decision to put sand on the beach, knowing it was going to wash away, to hold the line until we could get a more permanent solution. That happened. If you remember that chart where Chris listed all the projects over time where sand was placed, and included some soft growing and some terminal growing information, but a lot of sand was placed on the beach over and over again, knowing it was probably going to flow back into the river channel. So it's a effort to try to hold the line until a more permanent solution can be.
And actually, to understand, permanent solution is a real loose term. I mean, just, a permanent solution, we still replenish sand down at the west end where the terminal groin is, and that was a permanent solution. And when you're looking at all of these efforts, and the next one is in 2030.
Our next private project,
6 years,
2031.
31. But I mean, these projects are, our grandkids are going to be having the same conversation. The people that you leave your houses to, sell your houses to, are going to be confronted with the same situation. We're always just fighting the beach.
Live on an island.
It's part of the deal.
I thought the presentation was really detailed. It's somewhat complex. I really like the pictures. Pictures are worth 10,000 words. I know this is probably a difficult request, but for you all to give us your best pictorial estimate of what things would look like if the bond didn't pass. You all had bullet points. For people to see the picture, I mean, I came 2017 to see what was going on earlier was a shocker to me. And I think, the consequences of not keeping us with, your treatment of the beach, I think is key. But I think it's going to help people if they can see what the consequences would be visually in the bond.
Yeah. Good. Address that a little bit. So I think that's a tough one to answer, only in that, if you look out at the beach near the Shoals Club right now is accreting. And 6 months ago, we thought the whole pool, everything was going to drop in the ocean. To be able to say, yeah, if we don't do this, it's the end of the world. You can't say that anymore then, we're fighting something that is viable. Not viable, it's just flexible. And so
Highly dynamic.
Yeah. That's a good thing. And we're trying to stay viable.
Right.
I don't know if this is related or not, but you mentioned about the source of sand at Jay Bridge Shoals. Has anybody ever talked about the mouth of the creek? We used to dredge the mouth of Baldhead Creek all the time, and it's getting silted in, so you can't even get in and out of it most of the time. Has anybody ever thought about that as a source of sand?
Yeah, our use historically, our use of and dredging of the mouth of Baldhead Creek has been limited to placement of that sand directly on the Rowboat Road shoreline, or we put some of that on West Beach, south of the Marina Channel entrance. And it's very limited quantities. We're talking cubic yard volumes of 50, 75,000 in dredging compared to these projects that are 1 million or more. So that's what we use it for. But I hear you, and our coastal engineers on this line too, and we're noting that for potential need of and looking at the mouth of Bald Head Creek.
Maybe I missed it, just help me though. We vote in March. We anticipate that you will know whether the grant is approved before that. Is that accurate?
That is a possible scenario, yes.
It's only possible. That's what I'm trying, I thought I heard you really expect it to know that. Is that? I mean, that
Well, so-
really makes a big difference. I think.
Yeah, well, it does, but it's the federal government. I mean, we're not gonna,
Yeah.
they're gonna do what they're gonna do and we get an answer or not, it's.
Yeah. Okay.
And I would say, Dick, if we voted, if the federal decision doesn't come until after the primary day, and we vote to approve the 4.5 million, and after March 5th, the federal budget is approved and includes the 4.5, then we would use that and not issue bonds for 4.5.
And then we'd come back X number of years later, oh, now we got 7 million approved that we haven't used yet. Yeah.
Good morning. My name is Joe Maker. For people that don't know me, my history here is I've been coming to the island since 1999. I've owned property here since 2004, and I do live up on Shoals Watch, so this is very interesting to me. I'd like to first start off and say two things. Number one is you gave a great presentation. It was very detailed. It probably answered some of my questions that I had today. Chris did a great job on it, even though he's not here to let him know. Maybe he'll get his head too big, But the second thing is Olson's Associates and Coastal Protection Engineering. I have talked to Olson maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and I've listened to Coastal Protection. They're doing a great job. You've done a great selection on both of them, and I think they're really helping you out. Okay, however, now, I think it's important for us to understand all the options and educate at least the public on all the options. I think you know them, but maybe we don't. And to fully understand it, we have to understand all of it that are presented and then moving forward. I think it's important for us to analyze all the data, contract obligations with the Corps, because I've worked with attorneys before, and it's always a maybe in there, and there's always interpretation. So we got to look at what we can do to change those to be advantageous to the village and make the best decisions for the entire community. I like that you said we got to worry about East Beach as well as South Beach. I agree with that. I have reviewed the reports, including the most recent performed by CPE. I do have some questions. Some may have already been asked and some may have already been answered. However, I think there's some critical parts to those reports that may result in maybe the best alternative if we have not selected it. I'd like to highlight 3 areas. Oh, Chris, before I start off with my 3 areas, I want to say you did a great job of that.
I appreciate it. I apologize.
No, that's okay. We started off with the cost estimates and I highlighted that. And being in let's say design construction industry for over 40 years, I understand when I get cost estimates to somebody, they're high. And they're high because you're using them to determine a budget. Because the worst thing that can happen is you come in and say, I need $5 more. The rest of us hate you. But if you come in and say, I saved you this, we look good. So Chris, I know you're nervous to give real costs, but it would be nice for us to be educated on maybe some of the recent bids around here so we can get a real cost and say, this is what we're protecting. And we've seen this, but we're not guaranteeing it. I know it's putting you at risk, but I think that's critical for us as a community to understand real costs. Okay. There probably has been some beach renourishments along the coast recently. Maybe we can get those bids, take a look at them, break them down, and see what they have versus what we have. The second thing is that I've heard a lot of noise, and I won't say it's bad noise, on how much more it costs to put sand up on the east end than the south end or the west end. And I said, well, I really like to understand the differential cost. You're not talking about the main mobilization cost. You're not talking about the sand because the sand's the same. What you're talking about is maybe some extra pumps or larger pumps and some pipes. Let's get what a real number is so that people understand out here what the real number is. I don't think it's $3 or $4 million personally. Okay, I could be wrong, but I would stake my career on that. The second part I'd like to highlight is the erosion. I keep hearing that the erosion is higher on the east end. Well, I bought a lot there in 2012. There was not much erosion, and then 2016, something occurred because the erosion got major at that time, okay? What I'd like to know is, and you had it on there today, I'd like to see that chart you had of each location and how much the physical erosion was, because we were given a graphic. Well, the graphic's hard to read. I mean, especially as you get older, you see you need reading glasses. So I can't read the graphic, but I can read numbers. And I like to see each point and look at that and see what is the erosion rate at the east end versus the west end. Maybe we'd be surprised that it might be worse on the west end and you're protected, but the east end deserves to get protected too. Okay. The reason I say that there was no major, let's say, erosion on the east end for a long while, when I bought that lot 12, there was vegetation out there that I know was at least 10 years old, maybe 15 years old. So that beach was stable for a long time. Something happened. Was it natural? Was it other work that we did along there that could potentially, impact it? We don't know. And I can tell you that these models we do, they're very good, but they're very black box. And when you have a situation like ours, where you have a 26-mile shoal out there, you have a shipping channel, you have two coming like this, we're in an unusual situation. So maybe we have to kind of push it and say, okay, well, maybe we can reassess this, but let's find out what is the real cause of it. Because what happens a lot of times is we go out there and we fix the problem, but we don't fix the cause. In my world, I'll make it simple. In bridges, the bearings that hold the steel up, they would fail, they rust, everybody goes, well, fix the bearings. Well, if you fix the bearings, they're gonna rust again. The reason they were rusting was the joints. So you have to fix the joints. That's the same here. Let's try to figure out what is the actual cause. And maybe we can't solve it today because I've worked with the environmental people, I've worked with the Corps. It takes forever. So what you're doing now is implementation of things to salvage while we can, until we can get the actual best permanent in. We have to do that for the community. Okay. I won't be forever. Alternatives. I think you have some great alternatives in there. But as I said, I think we should really look at that core language and see if there's an opportunity to, let's say, push the limit on them or change the interpretation and see if there's a way to make it more beneficial to us. And it sounds like you have a lobbyist doing that already. So I think that's intact and you're working hard at it. There's always ways to be creative. I'll just leave it at that. We've done that in the past. We have some options by both engineers, okay? And we're looking at them and you have some options out there. However, if you only get the 13.5 million and you don't get the 4.5, maybe we need to look at an option that also supports the east end of the beach and not as much on the west end, that it kind of spreads out more equal to everybody. For example, the CPE report said we need to put groins out there. Well, why don't we say, let's take some of that sand and let's build a temporary groin, it's wider, and see what happens and see if that's going to work. That's a temporary situation that could potentially allow us to know if our groins are going to work. So those are a few of the things. There's a lot more I could have because I used to do some of this type, not this type work, but engineering work. But I think I'd like to close with that we live on a beach that's fluid. As I tell people, Mother Nature built barrier islands to protect the mainland. We, the humans, decided to build on it. It's as simple as that, So if we decided to build on it, we have to protect all of the community. And I hope that, I think that's what you're trying to do. And I appreciate your effort. And if you would like any more questions, believe me, I can review it. I'm an anal engineer. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Maker had a number. I know he had a number of questions. I did have Eric available to follow up with some comments on that. Eric. You there?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can.
I don't guess you need to see me.
No, we're good.
I think the first question had to do with the propriety of the cost estimates.
Can we turn it up real quick? Can you speak a little louder into your mic, Eric?
Yeah, I'll get closer. How about this? Is that any better?
Let's get better. Thanks.
Okay. I think the first question had to do with the propriety of the cost estimate. Cost estimating for beach fill projects is significantly different than normal cost estimating. Just to give you a little background, there are only 4 firms nationally that can construct this project, believe it or not. And unfortunately, right now, the cost of dredging has gone up significantly over the last couple of years, principally because of the amount of money that's been put into the economy through the Infrastructure Act. That is to say, there's hundreds of millions of dollars that are going into projects that involve dredging, mostly at ports and channels and things of that nature. And so by virtue of that, the competition right now is not good for constructing small projects. This is a relatively small project like this. I would say, in my opinion, the cost estimates that have been put forward do not have any they're not conservative, unfortunately. They are based pretty much on what we expect at this point in time. With respect to trying to ground truth them, there's, as Chris knows, we actually obtained the cost estimates for the Wrightsville Beach project, which is about to go under construction. It's a federal project, self-similar to this, has mobilization, has cost per cubic yards. The costs are unfortunately very self-similar to what we're predicting for this point in time. So the engineers have not put a contingency in this. In my opinion, the contingency is the $2.2 million that you have available. Let's see, remind me of the other question that you want answered, Chris.
Question about the true erosion rate, having documenting that. So
Yeah.
people can actually.
Well, that's a good point. The erosion rates that we have here are not based on modeling. They're based on surveys that are performed every 6 months and codified as monitoring reports at the end of each fiscal year. So the erosion rates that we have and that we know are actual. They're not hypothetical. Now, yes, the loss rates on the east end of the island are higher. And unfortunately, as I think Chris alluded to, and we've glibly said in many of these reports, what happens on the east end of South Beach is basically has to do with frying pan shoals. It's a morphological feature which shifts around and has shifted around to the disadvantage of the island over the last decade or two. The tail wags the dog there. It is not something that we can go modify. In contrast to, let's say, the other end of the island, where we can build a terminal structure to try to mitigate or to reduce portions of the impact of the navigation project on the beaches. At this point in time, there is no legislative authority to build any type of structure, be it a soft structure or a hard structure, on the east end of South Beach. So even those were thrown out hypothetically in the CP&E report. They are extremely hypothetical. There's really only 2 solutions on the East Beach, or the east end of South Beach in the vicinity of the point. One is to wait and see what happens. The other is to place sand and see what happens. Because again, it is not a very predictable circumstance due to the effects of the shoal. In this particular case, the village has proffered a solution which is 2-part. One is conventional, to put sand on the west end of South Beach in order to mitigate the known impacts of the navigation project, to keep the sand tube groin field full to protect the roadway and the infrastructure behind it, which we know if we stop doing that, we will lose that infrastructure. And also to comply with permit terms, which require sand placement there. Otherwise, the terminal groin theoretically would have to go away. It's a permit term associated with the terminal groin. On the east end, the village has proffered a temporary solution to place sand and to basically determine what the cost to benefit of that sand is over X number of years. We cannot predict with any great assurances as to the longevity of that sand because of the rate of erosion that occurs there, which occurs primarily or in entirety due to the effect of frying pan shoals and storm effects which occur. I think Chris alluded to the fact that over the last 12 months, there's actually been accretion there. And that's true. There's a level of accretion that we haven't seen for some time. However, it's also a fact that this is a very low energy year with respect to tropical storm and hurricane impacts, which are the main impetus for the loss of sand at that location. Due to the way the shoal moves around after major storm effects. So you have a twofold solution here, which depending on costs, the village can attempt to address. In the long term, there are two things potentially down the road. One of which Chris alluded to, which is trying to negotiate the change of terms and how the Corps places sand on the beaches. And I would tell you, it's not something you can modify at this point in time. Unfortunately, when Congress authorizes a navigation project and in this case, the disposal associated with that navigation project, you're dealing with the least cost option. And that's what the Corps has to fulfill. When the Corps eventually gets permits to modify the channel to increase its depth and width, at that point in time, you do have the possibility of negotiating terms, which again can be codified by Congress. The terms specifically, let's say, to change the way disposal occurs on Bald Head Island and probably Oak Island. But not until that time will you really have an option to change the Corps' process. And I'm sure the Corps will corroborate that. They have corroborated that over the years. Every time we have requested changes. So let's see. Any other questions?
The one specific was on the east end of the beach, there was vegetation that was over 10 years old that was there, and probably we lost 100 feet of that right after 216. Could he tell me what he feels is was the condition that made that occur all of a sudden? Because he knows it.
Yeah, that's a good point. You're basically dealing with storm impacts. There's no man-made activities which have caused that. What has happened over the years, what we've observed, both our firm and also CP&E observed it, is that the way frying pan shoals, the formation of frying pan shoals in the proximity of the shoreline dictates what happens there. And what we've seen is that during major storms and hurricanes, there's a breakthrough in the shoal formation between the actual shoreline and a portion of the shoal. And so what happens is you have this almost funnel created in the nearshore area whereby sand can be very easily driven off the island and through the shoal formation itself. And until that area infills, we won't enjoy the benefit again of frying pan shoals as we did a number of years ago when the beach condition down there was very robust and in a significantly different configuration, as was shown in some of the schematics there. And until that happens, the only thing you can do is to react to the existing conditions and to place sand, unless you can change legislation, which would allow you then to add structures or some type of structural solution to any beach fill activities at that location. So basically, what has occurred is basically storm impacts, and it's simple.
So can you take that area where the funnel is add sand specifically in that area and try to push the funnel out farther?
No, you cannot. We cannot even, the sand that you would do that, and actually CP&E gave that as a hypothetical. It would have to come out of Frying Pan Shoals. We can't even get a permit to borrow out of Frying Pan Shoals for purposes of beneficially affecting the beach itself, rather than some secondary type solution. So that is not an available solution.
Eric, one more question that Joe had brought up is the flexibility. He didn't say it this way, but flexibility in alternatives. So if you're looking at when the question was coming up about the extra 2.5 or whatever it was for that's allowed, if we go over, here's the money that we still have in reserve. The other approach on, other projects, not sand projects, but, other projects, different industries, change the scope. And do we have any flexibility in maybe not replacing all of the fabric tubes at the west end in order to make up any overages? Or is there something else that we have as you're thinking outside the box to change the scope to meet our money as opposed to just throwing more money?
That's a good question. You always said you have the opportunity to not build sand tube groins, but we would significantly recommend that you don't take that option.
Okay.
Only because you will endanger the roadway and the infrastructure behind it eventually. And you may lose one or two homes relatively quickly there. You have some flexibility. The way this project is going to be bid, or at least as we've in our minds, is that we'll build option A and option B. Option A is placement of only 500,000 cubic yards on the west end of South Beach. Option B, it would be the costing to place an additional 500,000 yards on the east end of South Beach. That gives you the option to pick and choose, particularly with respect to the east end solution. Sometimes you can negotiate these, you can always try to negotiate or to rebalance, let's say, these two bids. The problem of that is that you oftentimes get into a protest by the other bidders because you have changed the nature of what the selected solution is. And we've seen this happen in the past, where you'll get a protest from one of the other. Let's say you get 3 bids here. You're successful in getting 3 bids, or maybe even 4. Then another bidder will say, well, you've changed the selection of what you bid, and therefore you've juggled the costs, and we're going to protest it. So your ability to renegotiate is somewhat limited, a little bit dangerous. But it is what it is. If the other 3 or 4 bidders don't really care, and their bids were only courtesy bids, which in this case could be the case, you may not get a protest in trying to rebalance the nature of the options that you've put out and you've received bids on. One thing that I don't think Chris didn't mention, this is probably getting into the weeds a little bit, but in order to entice a dredger to build this project, and again, this is a small project, and because there's so many projects out there right now that are federal, which are large projects and much more of much more interest to the very limited dredging industry, which is only 4 firms nationally. We hope to garner some type of additional leverage by having this project constructed in the same general time frame that the maintenance project is done by the Corps of Engineers. It's a little bit unique, but the potential there is to get a dredging firm interested in building both projects. And with that said, we have to we have to remind everyone that the problem with that alternative is that we have a limited dredging window here, which is only between between November and March. So both projects would have to be constructed strategically within that time frame. It's not impossible, but it causes some potential conflicts in one firm being able to do it all. Because it would probably take that entire time frame to do both the maintenance of the channel and to place the 1 million cubic yards on Bald Head Island. So it's not impossible, but it's something that we're at least gonna, I would say, attempt to strategically take advantage of.
Okay, thanks.
One more question.
Joel Michaels, 307 Wellhead Way. Just a couple of observations. When you look at the projected tax needs to do this, you know, on its face, it seems digestible. But it's not like this event is sitting out there in isolation from other taxable events that have occurred. And not asking you to comment on pending litigation and such, I think my question is more, is there time to defer the options that would have additional tax implications, at least before the community knows what the repercussions might be from other litigation matters and the impact that it has on their taxes? You don't have to answer that question, but it's an easier judgment to make as a taxpayer when you look at this in isolation. It gets a little more challenging when you look at it in terms of tax rates that have incurred for other matters. Another statement is I regret that I didn't buy a villa in front of the Bald Head Island Club years ago.
Joel, I think the only way I would know to answer that is that this particular project is time dependent on the Wilmington Navigation Channel schedule. I mean, it's 2025 or it's 2032. We could probably try to look at doing something midstream, but and we understand, you know, the concern about litigation expenses. And we're doing everything we can to keep those at a minimum, and we're trying to do everything we can to settle. But we're just not having the success we're hoping to have along the way. I don't know how else to answer the question.
I have a question. Okay, so we have 13.5 and a 4.5, and I'm not sure whether this is a Brandon question or if both get approved. And so now we all of a sudden have approval for 18 million, and the bid comes in for part A, and it's 17 million. How do we do that? Can you take money away from one, you know, even though people voted that I'm voting for this bond for the east end, but you know, the west end came in a lot higher, it's gonna be more expensive. How does that work?
I might ask Brandon if he's still available to answer that question.
Yeah, that's what I was hoping.
Yeah, Brandon?
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I was not able to unmute myself for a while. So that's a good question. So there is flexibility because the ballot language and the way the bond orders work is the amounts are not restricted to geographic areas. They're just restricted to the type of project you're doing, which is beach nourishment. You're not allowed in the ballot language to restrict the geographic location of those projects. It's just the nature of the projects is beach nourishment. What's being described in terms of voter information in this session and during the public hearing is to explain why you would need the additional 4.5, which would be if voters agreed to do I guess it's scenario B project. So if the 13.5 passes and the 4.5 additional funds pass and the estimates come in higher for, the project A, you do have the ability to use funds, as needed to cover that cost. Of course, you'd also have the additional 2.2 million that you could authorize and issue at that point. So I guess just to recap, what we're doing now is we're going to voters to ask what's the largest amount of money we will authorize and give the village the ability to issue later. And what you guys are doing now is just educating voters as to the reasons why you might do 13.5 or 20 million or 18 million. And so you're not restricting the use by geographic area. You're just explaining why you would need a larger amount of money if the village decides to approve going forward with the project B. So again, you would have that flexibility. You do have the 2.2 authorized and issued. And again, this is just the authorization from the voters. But if you actually issue the bonds, there will be a later village council action required where obviously voters at that point and constituents would have the ability to weigh in on those decisions when it's actually time to, once you have the bids and you actually know the price, when it's actually time to issue, they can weigh in at that point as well.
I assumed, and I guess I'm wrong, is that you would bid these out together because as Mr. Olson said, they're small projects.
Yep.
So what would happen is if the entire project came in overpriced, then you have to renegotiate the scope totally. And that's where you might be able to make some changes. Or you could, scope it a certain way and here's scope A, here's scope B, bid on both. We've done that.
That's what he described was the second. You have an option A, you have a base bid, and you're gonna have an option bid.
And then option
Then the
C-
same bid
then option
package.
C could be spread it out along the whole beach.
The option is for you to decide whether or not you want to do part B. The base bid covers part A. In all probability, you will have sufficient funds to do that. And worst case, you would dip into the 2 million that you have. But you also have the opportunity with part A, if that ends up being the only thing you can afford to construct, you can renegotiate that by virtue of the volume that you place without changing substantially the project such that it would be protested. That is, say, if you couldn't afford 500,000 cubic yards, but you could afford 450, you have that opportunity to negotiate with the low bidder without being challenged.
Okay, thanks.
Chris, you talked about Irene, but you didn't say anything about Florence. So what happens if there's a major hurricane as far as FEMA goes?
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with what FEMA does.
So with Florence, that was like every storm, they're all unique to their own. With Florence, that was a different kind of storm that brought about a different type of issues with flooding from rainfall. Our beach, our shoreline, our dune system had minimal to no impacts because of the way the storm downgraded to a Cat 1 and so but with Irene and other storms in the future, as Eric mentioned, between doing our fall and spring beach profile monitoring and surveying, we have that data so that we have a benchmark or baseline of what the shoreline looks like pre-storm. And then after the storm, we'll survey it. And then Eric will be able to calculate the actual volume of sand loss due to the storm. And we factor that into a FEMA project worksheet, if you will, they call it. to then get reimbursement to replace that sand. With Irene, it just so happened the volume of loss and we had been working on permitting of dredging the mouth of Bald Head Creek, that we had those permits in hand, that we're able to use that sand to replace that sand loss there on West Beach and around the point there. So that's sort of how that works.
Thank you.
Okay. One final comment. We had, a couple of years ago, we did a poll to ask the non-voting members of this community, you know, what they felt about being non-voting members, et cetera. And one of the answers that came back was, we trust the people who are voting. And which is, you know, it's in and of itself, it highlights how important it is for you to get educated and understand exactly what you're voting for, because you're not just representing yourself, you're representing everybody who lives on this island or who has an investment in the island. So I commend you coming out and listening to this meeting.
And I know we received a few questions through the email, and staff will be working on completing or finalizing responses to those and putting them on the GeoBond web page where folks can see those.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
coming.
That's